Hey guys! Tonight we're drifting into one of the strangest businesses in human history. It involves no electricity, no freezers, no humming refrigerators tucked into kitchen corners, and definitely no convenient ice dispensers that somehow always decide to stop working exactly when you want cold water. Instead, we're talking about a time when something as ordinary as a handful of ice could be worth transporting across oceans. So dim the lights, fluff the pillow, settle under a blanket, and let your brain wander back to a world where winter itself became an export business. A world where entire fortunes were carved, not from gold, spices, or silk, but from frozen lakes. It sounds completely ridiculous, and somehow it worked. Imagine waking up in New England during the early 1800s. The air bites your face before breakfast. Snow piles against wooden houses. Ponds freeze into thick sheets of crystal. Most people look outside and think one thing. Well, that's inconvenient. One young Boston businessman looked outside and apparently thought something very different. I wonder if someone would buy this. Because, of course, he did. His name was Frederic Tudor. He would eventually become known as the Ice King, not because he ruled an icy kingdom, not because he lived in a castle made from frozen water, simply because he became astonishingly wealthy selling something people assumed would melt long before reaching customers. On paper, this sounded like history's worst business idea. Take frozen water, load it onto wooden ships, send those ships through tropical oceans, hope at least some of the cargo survives, then somehow convince wealthy customers that paying money for frozen water is completely reasonable. Modern investors probably would have politely suggested finding another hobby. Yet Tudor remained stubborn, very stubborn. History is often powered by brilliant people. Sometimes it's powered by extremely determined people. Occasionally, those happen to be the same person. Frederic Tudor belonged firmly in that category. He was born in 1783 into a comfortable Massachusetts family, comfortable enough that failure wouldn't immediately ruin him, which turned out to be helpful because he failed repeatedly. His first shipments melted, others arrived damaged, several business partners abandoned him, creditors chased him, he even spent time in debtor's prison. Not exactly the glamorous beginning one imagines for someone later nicknamed the Ice King. Still, he kept going, because apparently looking at frozen ponds and refusing to admit defeat became something of a personality trait.
Meanwhile, let's pause for a moment and appreciate just how different daily life looked before refrigeration. Today, we casually grab ice cubes without thinking. Restaurants hand us drinks filled nearly to the top with them. Convenience stores sell entire bags. Hotels provide little ice machines quietly humming down the hallway. We become mildly annoyed when they run out. 200 years ago, ice was luxury, not impossible to find, just incredibly seasonal. If winter froze nearby lakes, wonderful. If you lived somewhere warm, good luck. People certainly understood cooling. Ancient Persians built ingenious ice houses. Romans sometimes stored mountain snow. Indian rulers used Himalayan ice. Chinese courts experimented with preserving frozen water. Human beings had always loved cold drinks. The problem was scale. Nobody had created an international frozen supply chain until Frederic Tudor looked at frozen Massachusetts ponds and apparently thought, why shouldn't people in the Caribbean enjoy lemonade with ice? It sounds wonderfully optimistic, almost absurdly optimistic. His earliest voyages certainly encouraged the absurd part. Large chunks disappeared during transport. Customers doubted quality. Merchants questioned prices. Workers struggled with storage. Ships themselves weren't exactly floating refrigerators. They were wooden sailing vessels crossing warm oceans under blazing tropical sunshine. Everything about this business seemed determined to fail. Fortunately for Tudor, ice has an interesting property. Large blocks melt surprisingly slowly, especially insulated. This became one of the greatest discoveries of the industry. Not scientific discovery, people already understood insulation, but practical business discovery. Workers packed enormous blocks inside ships using sawdust. Yes, sawdust, one of history's least glamorous miracle materials. Tiny wood shavings left behind from lumber mills suddenly became valuable because they trapped air remarkably well. Instead of throwing them away, ice merchants stuffed every available gap with them. The result looked messy. It worked beautifully. Sometimes more than half of the cargo survived months at sea. Half. That still sounds terrible by modern standards, but half of something nobody else could deliver was still worth selling, especially to wealthy customers.
And wealthy customers loved novelty. Imagine hosting a dinner party in Havana around 1815. Outside, tropical heat presses against the windows. Guests wipe their foreheads. Servants arrive carrying chilled wine. Actual chilled wine. Perhaps even ice cream. People stare. Conversation stops. Someone inevitably asks, "Where did you get ice?" The answer? Massachusetts. Several thousand kilometers away. It sounded almost magical, which made it fashionable. Luxury has always enjoyed a good story. Diamonds, silk, tea, coffee, now frozen water. Humans are wonderfully predictable. If something is rare enough, eventually someone will pay impressive amounts to own. As demand grew, harvesting ice transformed into an enormous winter ritual. Entire communities participated. Frozen lakes became temporary factories. Not loud factories, oddly peaceful ones. Imagine sunrise over a frozen pond. Teams of horses pull strange plows across perfectly smooth ice. Workers score neat lines. Others follow with hand saws. Huge blocks separate almost like giant glass bricks. Hooks pull them toward shore. Ramps lift them into warehouses. The operation feels almost agricultural, except instead of harvesting wheat, they're harvesting winter itself. That's perhaps the strangest part. Farmers who spent summers growing crops could spend winters collecting frozen water. Nature conveniently scheduled both industries. Snow fell, lakes froze, harvest season arrived. No seeds required. Warehouses appeared near lakes throughout New England. These weren't ordinary barns. They were enormous, insulated structures built specifically for preserving thousands upon thousands of tons of ice. Packed tightly together with layers of sawdust, huge blocks could survive astonishingly long periods, even through warm summers. Visitors often described walking inside these warehouses as entering another season. Outside might be humid July. Inside still felt like February. Rather pleasant, honestly, assuming you brought a jacket. Business expanded steadily. Boston exported ice to Charleston, then Savannah, then New Orleans, then Cuba, then Martinique.
Eventually, shipments reached South America, India, even parts of Southeast Asia. Imagine explaining this to someone living in medieval Europe. So, you collect winter, yes, put it onto ships, correct, send it through the tropics, exactly, and make millions. I know, it sounds ridiculous. History occasionally specializes in sounding ridiculous, which is one reason it's endlessly enjoyable. And we're only getting started. By the time Frederic Tudor's business finally began to resemble something other than an expensive hobby with spectacular shipping problems, the people working around New England's frozen lakes had become surprisingly good at harvesting ice. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody wrote epic poems about it. No painters rushed to capture heroic portraits of men carrying frozen blocks across snowy fields. Although, to be fair, if they had, everyone in the paintings would probably have looked equally cold. Instead, the work became wonderfully organized. Imagine standing beside a frozen lake just after sunrise in January. The snow has been brushed away from a huge section of smooth ice. It stretches across the landscape like polished glass. Everything is quiet, except for horses snorting little clouds into the air and workers chatting through scarves wrapped halfway across their faces. The first job wasn't cutting, it was measuring, because even something as simple as frozen water becomes much easier to sell when every block is roughly the same size. Large wooden markers helped divide the lake into neat rows. Special plows fitted with metal blades scratched long straight lines into the surface. One pass became two, two became four. Eventually, the shallow grooves crossed each other until the lake looked remarkably like a giant checkerboard. Nature had produced the ice. Human beings immediately organized it into inventory. That feels very human somehow. The cutting itself required patience rather than speed. Workers followed the guide marks using long hand saws. The blades bit deeper with each pass until thick rectangular blocks finally separated from the frozen sheet. Then came one of the oddly satisfying moments of the entire process. With a gentle push using long iron poles, an individual block drifted free. No dramatic cracking, no explosive break, just a quiet movement as an enormous crystal floated calmly in dark water beneath the surrounding ice. Watching old illustrations today, it's almost hypnotic. Thousands of perfectly shaped blocks gliding along narrow channels cut into frozen lakes. It resembles a strange frozen canal system designed entirely for water that had temporarily forgotten how to be liquid. Workers guided each block toward conveyor ramps. Some systems relied on horses walking steadily uphill. Others used simple mechanical belts powered by gears. Nothing moved especially quickly. It didn't need to. Winter wasn't in much of a hurry. Once inside the warehouse, another team stacked the ice with remarkable precision. Large blocks fitted together like oversized bricks. Between the layers came more sawdust, lots of sawdust, entire mountains of the stuff. The lumber industry had accidentally become the ice industry's greatest ally. Without realizing it, sawmills were producing the perfect insulating material, almost for free. Sometimes history's greatest partnerships happen completely by accident. Inside these storage houses, the temperature remained astonishingly stable. Visitors often described opening the heavy wooden doors during summer and feeling a wave of cold air drift gently outward. Outside, people wiped sweat from their foreheads. Inside, winter patiently waited. It must have felt almost magical. Today, we expect technology to preserve food, medicine, and comfort. Back then, careful engineering and good insulation accomplished many of the same goals without plugging a single thing into an electrical outlet. Rather impressive, really. Of course, none of this mattered unless somebody actually wanted to buy ice. Fortunately for Tudor, people absolutely did.
The Caribbean quickly became one of his favorite markets. That might sound backwards. Why would the hottest places become the biggest customers? Simple. Heat creates demand. In Boston, winter arrived free of charge every year. In Havana or Kingston, cold existed only if someone imported it. Scarcity has always increased value. The wealthy embraced imported ice almost immediately. Doctors recommended it for reducing fevers. Hotels advertised chilled drinks. Restaurants offered desserts that previously seemed impossible in tropical climates. Even simple glasses of cold water became symbols of refinement. Imagine inviting friends to dinner. Everyone expects another warm evening. Then servants appear carrying silver bowls packed with sparkling ice. Conversation immediately shifts, not because the food suddenly became better, because frozen water had become entertainment. People have always enjoyed showing guests unusual things, sometimes expensive paintings, sometimes rare wines, sometimes blocks of frozen ponds from Massachusetts. Human nature changes surprisingly little. Naturally, where luxury goes, competition follows. Other entrepreneurs watched Tudor's success with growing interest. Many decided they could surely do the same thing. After all, the product literally fell from the sky every winter. How difficult could it be? As it turned out, quite difficult. Harvesting ice required timing. Transport required planning. Storage required engineering. Shipping required patience. Customers required reliability. Miss just one of those pieces, and profits melted almost as quickly as the cargo. Tudor possessed one advantage beyond simple determination. He understood relationships. He spent years building trust with merchants, ship captains, warehouse owners, and local distributors. When customers opened a shipment bearing his name, they expected quality. That reputation became almost as valuable as the ice itself. Business, then as now, often depends less on having the best product than on convincing people you'll consistently deliver it. Meanwhile, something interesting happened back in New England. Communities slowly adjusted their yearly rhythm around the ice harvest. Winter was no longer simply the quiet season between harvests. It became productive. Farmers who couldn't work frozen fields found seasonal employment cutting ice. Blacksmiths repaired tools, carpenters expanded storage buildings, shipbuilders gained new contracts. Even horse owners found steady winter work hauling enormous frozen blocks. Entire local economies quietly benefited from something previous generations had largely ignored. It's amusing to imagine someone explaining this to their grandfather. "So what are you doing this winter?" "Oh, I'm collecting frozen lake water so wealthy people in India can cool their drinks." A long pause probably followed. Then, perhaps, "You're collecting what?" Because, yes, India eventually became one of Tudor's boldest markets. If shipping ice across the Caribbean sounded ambitious, sending it halfway around the world sounded almost impossible. The voyage lasted months. Ships crossed the Atlantic, rounded the southern tip of Africa, and sailed across the Indian Ocean before finally reaching ports like Calcutta. By all reasonable expectations, the cargo should have arrived as warm water.
Instead, enough survived to astonish customers. When the first shipments reached India in the 1830s, crowds reportedly gathered simply to watch blocks of New England ice being unloaded. Many people had never seen natural ice before. Imagine touching something so cold it seemed almost unreal while standing beneath tropical sunshine. It must have felt like witnessing a small piece of another planet. Hotels rushed to purchase supplies. British officials living in colonial India eagerly embraced chilled drinks. Doctors experimented with medical uses. Ice houses appeared near major cities specifically to preserve these imported treasures. For a brief moment in history, winter had become one of New England's most successful exports. And all because one stubborn merchant refused to accept that frozen water belonged only where nature had left it. As we slowly drift onward, we'll discover that this remarkable trade reshaped cities, inspired ingenious inventions, and eventually created the very technologies that would bring the natural ice empire to its quiet and rather ironic end. After all, history has a habit of rewarding bold ideas before inventing something that makes them completely unnecessary.
By the middle of the 19th century, something quietly extraordinary had happened. The natural ice trade was no longer an experiment. It was no longer a risky gamble that made bankers sigh and neighbors politely wonder whether Frederic Tudor had finally lost his mind. It had become an industry, a remarkably successful one. Entire fleets now sailed with cargo that only a few decades earlier most people would have assumed impossible to transport. If someone had predicted in 1800 that frozen ponds from Massachusetts would one day cool drinks in Havana, preserve food in New Orleans, chill desserts in Calcutta, and arrive in ports across Asia, they probably would have received the sort of polite smile usually reserved for people suggesting they intended to build a bridge to the moon. Yet here everyone was, doing exactly that. Well, not the moon bridge, just the frozen water part. And somehow that was almost as unbelievable. One of the most fascinating things about the ice trade wasn't simply the business itself. It was how quickly people adjusted to it. Human beings are wonderfully adaptable. The first time something extraordinary happens, everyone stops to stare. By the 100th time, it becomes part of the weekly shopping list. The arrival of an ice ship gradually transformed from a spectacular public event into ordinary commerce. Merchants checked inventories, warehouse workers unloaded cargo, customers placed orders. Children probably ran past enormous blocks of crystal on the docks without giving them much thought, which is amusing because those same blocks had traveled farther than many people ever would. Imagine being a block of ice. You begin life floating peacefully in a frozen Massachusetts pond. A few weeks later, someone cuts you into a neat rectangle, packs you in sawdust, loads you onto a sailing ship, and sends you halfway around the globe. You experience more international travel than the average 19th century citizen. Not bad for frozen water. Of course, not every shipment survived perfectly. Some voyages lost 20% of their cargo, others lost 40%. Occasionally, storms delayed ships long enough for even more ice to disappear. The captains accepted this almost philosophically. Melting wasn't a disaster, it was simply another operating expense, rather like paying for fuel today, except the fuel happened to be sunshine. There was another challenge as well.
Ice doesn't politely remain where you leave it. Even inside warehouses, blocks slowly shrank. Workers had to move stock carefully, rotate supplies, sweep away meltwater, and constantly monitor temperatures. Running an ice warehouse demanded attention every day of the year. Winter might create the inventory, summer paid the bills. This balance shaped the rhythm of entire businesses. Owners watched weather reports with remarkable enthusiasm. A cold winter meant thicker ice. Thicker ice meant larger harvests. Large harvests usually meant healthy profits. Warm winters, on the other hand, well, nobody enjoyed warm winters quite as little as ice merchants. A mild season could reduce supplies dramatically. Suddenly, everyone became amateur meteorologists. People who normally discussed shipping schedules now debated snowfall, freezing temperatures, and lake conditions with almost scholarly seriousness. Weather had always mattered. Now, it directly influenced international trade. Nature still held the strongest bargaining position. As demand expanded, harvesting techniques improved. Machines appeared, horse-drawn equipment became more sophisticated. Engineers designed mechanical elevators capable of lifting heavy blocks into towering warehouses with surprising efficiency. Watching old photographs today is strangely mesmerizing. Rows of enormous ice blocks move along wooden tracks with almost factory-like precision. The workers wear thick coats and heavy boots. Steam rises from horses. Everything appears calm, deliberate, methodical. There is no frantic rushing, no dramatic urgency. Only steady work performed by people who know exactly what comes next.
It's oddly peaceful. Perhaps that's one reason the history of ice feels so relaxing. Compared with tales of battles and revolutions, this story unfolds quietly. Nobody is invading anyone. Nobody is declaring war. Everyone is simply trying to keep frozen water from becoming regular water, an unexpectedly wholesome goal. Well, mostly wholesome. Like any profitable industry, the ice trade also had its problems. Working with enormous frozen blocks wasn't entirely risk-free. Ice is heavy, very heavy. A single block could weigh hundreds of pounds. Workers relied on long iron tongs, hooks, ropes, sleds, and ramps to move them safely. Experience mattered. One careless movement could damage valuable cargo or someone's foot. Fortunately, experienced crews developed impressive skill. Many spent decades in the trade. By watching one another, younger workers learned efficient techniques passed from season to season. Entire families sometimes participated. Fathers harvested alongside sons. Brothers loaded ships together. Neighbors returned each winter to familiar lakes. The harvest became almost ceremonial. Communities knew exactly when it would begin. Children watched, merchants prepared storage, ship captains finalized schedules. Everything depended on winter arriving on time. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it kept everyone waiting. Nature rarely worries about business deadlines.
Meanwhile, customers continued discovering new uses for imported ice. Restaurants expanded menus. Fresh oysters traveled farther. Milk spoiled less quickly. Butter survived longer journeys. Bakers experimented with delicate desserts that previously would have collapsed in warm kitchens. Doctors used ice packs to reduce fevers. Hospitals gradually appreciated the benefits of cooling patients during certain illnesses. Even florists discovered that flowers stayed fresher longer when kept cold. a simple frozen lake suddenly influenced dozens of different industries. Quite an impressive career change. There was also something deeply social about ice. Think about the experience of drinking a chilled beverage during a sweltering summer afternoon. Even today, it feels refreshing. Now imagine experiencing that sensation for the very first time. No humming refrigerator, no electric freezer, just a servant dropping crystal clear chunks of imported ice into a glass. The sound alone would have been memorable. That gentle clink, a small sound carrying thousands of miles of travel. People associated ice with elegance. Hotels proudly advertised it. Newspapers occasionally mentioned impressive shipments arriving safely. Visitors described luxurious dinners where cold desserts amazed guests accustomed to warm sweets. Ice became part of hospitality. Offering a chilled drink quietly suggested prosperity. Not extravagance necessarily, just comfort. Civilization has always enjoyed making difficult things appear effortless, and that's exactly what successful ice merchants accomplished. The easier cold seemed to obtain, the more invisible the enormous effort behind it became. That may be one of history's recurring themes. The greatest systems often disappear into everyday life. We stop noticing them because they work so well. The ice trade reached that point. People expected deliveries, expected cold drinks, expected preserved food. Few paused to imagine frozen lakes hundreds or thousands of miles away, quietly supplying their comfort. Of course, no industry lasts forever. Even while the natural ice business expanded, clever inventors across Europe and America were experimenting with something that sounded almost unbelievable. What if people didn't have to wait for winter? What if cold could be manufactured? At first, the idea seemed expensive, complicated, impractical. Ice merchants weren't especially worried. Artificial refrigeration looked more like an interesting scientific curiosity than a commercial threat. After all, nature produced excellent ice for free. Why build complicated machines? History, however, enjoys asking dangerous questions, especially questions beginning with, "What if we could make this easier?" Most established industries underestimate those questions. Horse breeders underestimated automobiles. Stagecoach companies underestimated railroads. Film manufacturers underestimated digital photography. And the natural ice trade would eventually underestimate refrigeration. Not immediately. There were still decades of prosperity ahead, still countless lakes to harvest, still ships to load, still tropical ports eagerly awaiting another cargo of frozen New England winter. But somewhere in a quiet laboratory, engineers were already taking the first small steps toward a future where winter itself would no longer be necessary. By the 1850s, the natural ice business had become something that would have seemed almost unbelievable just a generation earlier. Frozen lakes had become valuable. Entire towns depended on the winter harvest. Merchants confidently signed contracts months in advance, expecting another season of reliable profits. It almost felt as though the business would continue forever. History, however, rarely allows any industry to remain comfortable for very long. While ice merchants focused on frozen ponds, a different group of people spent their days inside workshops and laboratories. These weren't sailors. They weren't lumbermen. They weren't warehouse owners. They were engineers. And engineers have a habit of asking questions that make established businesses rather nervous. One of those questions sounded surprisingly simple. What if cold didn't have to come from winter? At first, the idea seemed almost laughable. Cold came from nature. Everyone knew that. Lakes froze, snow fell, mountains stayed icy. That was simply how the world worked. Trying to manufacture cold inside a machine sounded almost like trying to manufacture sunshine. Interesting in theory, probably impossible in practice. Yet experiment after experiment slowly suggested otherwise. Early refrigeration machines were enormous. They were noisy, complicated, expensive to build, even more expensive to maintain. If you compared one of those early machines to a frozen lake, the lake still seemed like the obvious winner. Nature, after all, charged no fee for making ice every winter. The machine demanded fuel, maintenance, mechanics, and constant attention. By the early decades of the 20th century, the world had begun to change in ways that would have seemed impossible to the people who first harvested ice from frozen ponds. Electricity slowly spread through cities. Factories became more efficient. Homes filled with inventions that earlier generations could barely imagine. And sitting quietly in the corner of many kitchens was one of the most important of them all, the refrigerator. At first glance, it didn't appear particularly remarkable. There were no polished blocks of sparkling ice, no horses waiting outside, no familiar knock from the iceman. Just a simple metal cabinet that quietly stayed cold day and night. It almost seemed boring. But history often hides its greatest revolutions inside ordinary-looking objects. The refrigerator was one of those revolutions. Families who bought one quickly noticed how different daily life became. Milk lasted longer, fresh vegetables stayed crisp for days, leftover meals no longer needed to be eaten immediately. Butter remained firm even during the hottest weeks of summer. For the first time in history, many households controlled their own supply of cold. That simple change gave people something previous generations had never possessed: freedom from the seasons. Meanwhile, in towns across New England, many of the old ice houses still stood. Some remained busy, others grew strangely quiet. The giant wooden buildings that had once overflowed with frozen blocks now echoed with empty space. Dust gathered where workers had once stacked ice from floor to ceiling. Heavy wooden ramps slowly weathered beneath years of rain and snow. Nature patiently reclaimed places that had once bustled with activity. Older workers occasionally visited the lakes during winter, out of habit, perhaps, or maybe curiosity. They remembered mornings when hundreds of people filled the frozen surface, the steady scrape of iron blades, the distant voices calling instructions, the horses pulling sleds loaded with crystal-clear blocks. Now many lakes rested in complete silence. Snow covered the same frozen water. The same winter winds drifted across the ice, but the people had largely disappeared. There is something quietly emotional about industries that fade away, not because they failed, not because they made poor decisions, but because the world simply found a different path. Some companies adapted. Rather than harvesting natural ice, they invested in refrigeration equipment. The skills of organizing deliveries, managing customers, and storing cold still mattered, only the source of that cold had changed. Other businesses could not adapt so easily. Small family operations that depended entirely on frozen lakes slowly closed their doors. Their tools were sold, their horses found new work, their warehouses stood empty. In many communities, the change happened gradually enough that few noticed at first. One fewer wagon this year, another company gone the next. Eventually, children grew up without ever seeing an ice harvest. To them, stories about cutting giant blocks from lakes sounded almost like fairy tales. And yet, photographs proved otherwise. Black and white images captured endless rows of workers standing on frozen lakes. Massive ice blocks gleamed in the winter sunlight. Horse-drawn conveyors climbed toward towering storage houses. Looking at those photographs today feels almost surreal. The scenes belong to a world that existed surprisingly recently, yet feels centuries away. After decades of booming success, the ice trade was no longer the unstoppable force it once had been. But its disappearance did not happen suddenly. It happened quietly, almost gently. In small towns across New England, winter still arrived every year just like before. Lakes still froze, snow still covered rooftops. The wind still carried that sharp, familiar cold. But something important had changed. The people were gone. Where hundreds of workers once gathered at sunrise, there were now only footprints in the snow, quickly erased by wind and time. Old workers often found themselves walking near the lakes during winter mornings, not because they needed to work, but because they could not forget. The sound of saws cutting ice still lived in their memory. The shouting of foremen across frozen water still echoed in their minds. The rhythmic crack of ice blocks separating from the lake's surface still felt real, even when the lake was silent. Many of them had spent their entire lives inside this seasonal rhythm. Winter meant purpose. Winter meant work. Winter meant survival. And now winter meant nothing more than quiet scenery. Some of these men would stand at the edge of the frozen lake for long minutes without speaking, just watching, as if waiting for history to return. But history never returned in the same way. It simply moved forward. Meanwhile, in cities far away, people who had never seen an ice harvest were already using electric refrigerators without thinking twice. Cold had become invisible. No longer something harvested from nature, but something produced silently inside a machine. And yet, even as technology replaced tradition, something strange happened. People still remembered ice, not as a product, but as a feeling. The sound of ice being dropped into a glass, the sight of sunlight reflecting through crystal clear blocks, the experience of a summer drink suddenly becoming cold in a warm room. These memories lingered longer than the industry itself. In some towns, former ice workers tried to move into new jobs. Some joined factories, some worked in transportation. Some became warehouse supervisors in newly industrialized cold storage facilities. A few even found work maintaining early refrigeration systems, machines that were, ironically, the descendants of the very industry they had once served. But not everyone adapted easily. For many, the ice trade was not just a job, it was identity, a way of life shaped by seasons, weather, and physical labor. And when that disappeared, something else disappeared with it. A rhythm of life that modern machines could never fully replace. Still, the world did not pause. It never does. Railroads expanded, cities grew taller, electric lights replaced oil lamps, and refrigerators slowly entered homes that once depended entirely on seasonal ice deliveries. With each passing year, the connection to frozen lakes became weaker until eventually it became history, not experience, just story. And somewhere, deep in the silent lakes of New England, winter continued its ancient cycle, without interruption. Ice formed, snow fell, water froze. Nature never changed its routine. Only humans did. By the closing years of the 19th century, the change was no longer something people could ignore. It was everywhere. Slowly but clearly. The old ice wagons that once ruled city streets were becoming rare sights. At first, people barely noticed. One less wagon on Monday, a quieter street on Wednesday, a missing delivery route by the end of the month. But over time, the absence became impossible to ignore. Inside factories and breweries, a new kind of technology was taking control. Mechanical refrigeration systems were improving rapidly. They no longer depended on winter. They no longer depended on frozen lakes. They no longer depended on ships crossing oceans with melting cargo. They simply worked, day and night, summer or winter. For business owners, this was revolutionary. For the old ice merchants, it was unsettling. Not because the demand disappeared instantly, but because it slowly shifted away. First, it was breweries, then meat storage companies, then hotels, then hospitals. One industry after another quietly made the same decision. Why depend on nature when a machine can do it any time? In New England, ice harvesting still continued for a while. The lakes still froze each winter, the saws still cut through thick sheets of ice, the horses still pulled sleds across the frozen surface. But something had changed in the atmosphere. It was no longer confidence, it was uncertainty. Workers still did their jobs, but fewer people hired them. Warehouses still stood tall, but some were half empty. Contracts that once guaranteed full seasons were now shorter and more cautious. And above everything else, there was a new feeling spreading quietly through the industry, a feeling no one liked to admit, that the future was no longer theirs. Meanwhile, in cities filled with electricity and growing innovation, another revolution was taking place inside kitchens. The refrigerator was becoming smaller, cheaper, and more reliable. What had once been a luxury item was slowly becoming a household necessity. Families who installed one experienced a quiet but powerful change. No more waiting for deliveries, no more melting blocks, no more scheduling life around ice. Cold had become personal, private, always available. And that changed everything. Because once people no longer depended on ice delivery, they no longer needed the Iceman. And once they no longer needed the Iceman, they no longer needed the entire system built around him. The wagons stopped first, then the routes, then the companies, until one day the streets that once echoed with the sound of iron wheels and horse hooves fell completely silent. But even in silence, history does not disappear. It transforms. And somewhere beneath the modern world of refrigeration and global supply chains, the legacy of those frozen lakes still remained, invisible, but everywhere. By the early decades of the 20th century, the world had fully stepped into a new era. The natural ice trade, once a global empire of frozen lakes and wooden ships, was now quietly fading into history. In cities, the Iceman was no longer a daily visitor. His wagon no longer rattled through morning streets. His footsteps no longer echoed on wooden porches. And behind kitchen doors, the familiar icebox had been replaced by something far more powerful, the refrigerator. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive with horses or workers. It simply existed, quiet, constant, unchanging. Cold was no longer something delivered. It was something created. Inside factories, inside homes, inside machines that never slept. And with that change, an entire world disappeared. Ice houses that once stood like giants beside frozen lakes were abandoned, their thick wooden walls slowly aged under rain and wind. Their interiors, once filled with glittering blocks stacked from floor to ceiling, became empty shadows of what they used to be. The lakes themselves, however, never changed. They still froze every winter. They still reflected the pale winter sun. They still carried the same silence they had carried for thousands of years. But the purpose had changed. Where once hundreds of workers stood cutting, lifting, and transporting ice, now only wind moved across the surface. The world had moved on, but the memory remained. In museums, in photographs, in forgotten buildings hidden in forests, the story still survives. And when we look back today, it no longer feels like just an industry. It feels like a chapter of human imagination, a time when people looked at frozen water and saw opportunity, a time when winter itself became a product, a time when determination, patience, and creativity turned nature into a global supply chain. Frederic Tudor's dream did not simply create wealth, it changed how humanity understood cold itself. And even though his empire eventually disappeared, its impact never did. Because every modern refrigerator still carries the same idea he once believed in, that cold can be moved, stored, and shared. As the night settles over those quiet New England lakes once again, there are no ships waiting at the docks, no saws cutting through ice, no horses pulling heavy loads across frozen fields. Only stillness, only winter, only nature continuing its ancient rhythm. And somewhere in that silence, history gently reminds us that even the most powerful industries in the world are temporary, but ideas can last forever. Even today, long after the last ice wagons disappeared from city streets, the story of natural ice still lingers quietly inside the modern world. It is no longer visible, but it is everywhere. Every supermarket freezer, every hospital cooling system, every shipping container carrying frozen food across oceans, every glass of chilled water served without a second thought. All of it carries a hidden echo of the past. The world didn't forget cold, it simply learned how to create it. And in doing so, it built something far more powerful than anyone in the 1800s could have imagined. A system where temperature is no longer controlled by seasons, but by technology. Yet, if you look closely at history, the foundation of this entire system was not built in laboratories or factories. It was built on frozen lakes, on winter mornings when men gathered before sunrise, on wooden saws cutting precise lines into ice, on horses pulling massive blocks across silent snowfields, on ships crossing oceans carrying pieces of New England winter to distant tropical ports. Those moments may seem distant now, but they were the beginning, the first step in humanity's journey toward mastering cold. And like many beginnings, they looked simple at the time, just people working with what nature gave them. But hidden inside that simplicity was something extraordinary. The idea that cold could be harvested, transported, and shared. That idea changed everything. Without it, refrigeration might have taken a very different path. Food preservation would have developed more slowly. Medicine storage might have been less reliable. Global trade of fresh and frozen goods could have been limited for much longer. The natural ice trade didn't just serve the world, it taught the world. And now, as we stand in the present day, the frozen lakes of New England have returned to their quiet existence, no longer industrial hubs, no longer global suppliers, just water, ice, wind, and time. But if you listen carefully to the silence, you can almost imagine the past still moving across the surface. The distant sound of saws, the creaking of wooden sleds, the calls of workers guiding frozen blocks toward the shore. All of it now gone, yet never truly lost, because history does not always disappear when industries end. Sometimes it simply transforms into the systems we use every day. And in that sense, the kingdom that sold ice never really ended. It became the world we live in now.
And finally, if you return once more to the quiet lakes of New England, you might notice something almost unchanged. The water still freezes in winter. The snow still falls softly across the trees. The wind still moves across the open ice with the same patient rhythm it always has. Nature never forgot its cycle. It never needed to. The only thing that changed was us. Once, these frozen lakes were the center of a global industry. They connected continents without electricity. They carried cold across oceans on wooden ships. They built fortunes, jobs, and entire communities around a single idea, that winter could be harvested. Now, everything feels still again, but not empty, peaceful, because what once was a world of labor, saws, horses, and ships, has transformed into memory, history, and quiet landscapes. Yet even today, if you stand there long enough, you can almost feel it. The weight of the ice blocks being cut, the vibration of saws slicing through frozen water, the voices of workers calling across the snow, the slow movement of sleds carrying winter toward the shore. All of it existing only in imagination now. And maybe that is where it belongs, because progress does not erase the past, it builds on it. Every refrigerator that hums in a kitchen today, every cold drink poured without effort, every frozen meal stored safely for weeks, all of it carries a silent connection to those frozen ponds. The kingdom that sold ice is gone, but its idea remains alive in every corner of modern life. And as the lake freezes once more under a fading winter sky, we are reminded of something simple yet powerful. Even the most ordinary things can shape the entire world if someone is willing to see them differently. And so, our journey finally comes to rest. Not with noise, not with endings that crash or break, but with silence. The same kind of silence that once covered the frozen lakes before any human ever saw value in them, before saws touched ice, before horses crossed frozen fields, before ships carried winter across oceans. There was only nature. And now, after everything, there is nature again. The cycle never changed. Only our role inside it did. For a brief moment in history, humans learned how to borrow winter, to shape it, to store it,
to send it across the world like a precious cargo. And then, just as quietly, we learned how to create it ourselves. Machines replaced lakes, electricity replaced seasons, refrigerators replaced wagons. But the idea remained the same. Cold, once discovered as a resource, never disappeared again. It simply changed its form. If you listen carefully to the world today, inside the hum of a refrigerator, inside the soft clink of ice in a glass, inside the frozen silence of a supermarket aisle, you can still hear it, a faint echo of saws cutting ice under a winter sunrise, of workers shouting across frozen lakes, of ships carrying pieces of January into tropical heat. All of it still exists, not in the world outside, but in the memory of how that world was built. And now, as this story comes to a gentle end, we leave the frozen lakes behind once more, not because they are gone, but because they no longer need us. They continue, as they always have, free, silent, endless. And somewhere in that silence, the Ice Kingdom sleeps.
And now, there is nothing left to tell. Not because the story is empty, but because it has already completed its journey. From frozen lakes to ocean-crossing ships, from sawdust-insulated warehouses to bustling city streets, from the Iceman's wagon to the quiet hum of modern refrigerators, everything has already changed. And yet, in another way, nothing has changed at all. Water still freezes when winter arrives. Snow still falls without asking permission. The wind still moves across silent lakes in the same patient rhythm. Nature never learned the word industry. It only continues. For a brief moment in human history, we believed we had captured winter. We cut it into blocks. We packed it into ships. We sold it across continents like gold carved from ice. And for a while, it worked. But time does not preserve businesses. It transforms them. The ice houses fell silent. The wagons disappeared. The workers moved on. The lakes returned to peace. And in their place, a new kind of cold was born. Invisible, electrical, constant. The refrigerator became the new winter. Small, quiet, ordinary. So ordinary that we forget it was ever an invention at all. But if you ever stop for a moment and listen to the sound of ice dropping into a glass, you might hear it. Not just ice, but history. A soft reminder of frozen lakes in New England, of men working before sunrise, of ships crossing oceans with winter stored below decks, of a world that once turned cold into possibility. And now, as this entire journey finally comes to rest, we leave it the way all great stories are left, not with an ending, but with continuation. Because the Ice Kingdom did not truly vanish, it simply changed its shape and became the world we live in today. Before we fully close this story, there is one last thing worth understanding. The Ice Kingdom was never really about ice. It was about imagination. It was about what happens when human beings look at something ordinary and decide it can become extraordinary.
A frozen lake was never just frozen water. It became a factory, a business, a global connection between worlds that had never touched before. And when that idea spread, it reshaped. And now, at last, we arrive at the end of everything. Not an ending of loss, but an ending of understanding. The Ice Kingdom rises in memory one final time. Frozen lakes under early morning light, wooden saws cutting perfect lines into silence, horses moving slowly across endless white fields, ships carrying winter across oceans no one thought possible to cross with ice alone. A world built on patience, on seasons, on effort, on belief that even nature itself could become part of human trade. And then, as always in history, time moved forward. Machines replaced winters. Electricity replaced distance. Refrigeration replaced harvest. And the lakes were left to the wind again. But nothing was truly lost, because what was created there never depended only on ice. It depended on an idea. That idea still lives. Every time a refrigerator quietly hums in a kitchen, every time ice falls into a glass on a hot day, every time food stays fresh because cold is preserved, the Ice Kingdom continues. Not as a place, but as a memory built into modern life. So, as we stand once more beside the silent, frozen lake, we do not say goodbye with sadness, we say it with gratitude, for a time when humans looked at winter and saw possibility instead of cold. And now, the wind moves across the ice one last time, soft, endless, peaceful. The lake remains, the world moves on, and the story gently disappears into silence. Good night. As another January morning quietly arrived across New England, the frozen lakes looked almost unchanged from the days of Frederic Tudor. The surface shimmered beneath fresh snow. The trees stood perfectly still, their branches dressed in white. The cold air carried the same crisp scent that generations of ice harvesters had known by heart. Nature, it seemed, had never forgotten its part of the story. The lakes continued freezing every winter just as faithfully as they always had. Only the people were missing. Several decades earlier, these frozen shores would already have been alive before sunrise. Lanterns would have glowed through the darkness as workers prepared their tools. The distant sound of horses pulling wooden sleds would have echoed across the snow. Voices, laughter, and the steady scrape of iron blades would soon fill the morning air. Every person knew exactly what needed to be done. Time mattered. Winter never stayed forever. Now, the silence felt almost unfamiliar. Only a handful of men walked slowly toward the frozen lake, carrying old ice saws across their shoulders. Most of them had gray hair. Some walked with a slight limp earned after years of difficult work. Others had sons who no longer joined them, choosing instead to work in factories, where electricity had replaced the changing seasons. The younger generation admired the old trade, but very few wanted to depend on winter for their livelihood anymore. Among the small group was Samuel, a man who had spent more than 60 winters harvesting natural ice. His hands had grown rough from decades of gripping heavy iron tongs. His shoulders still carried the quiet memory of lifting countless frozen blocks onto sleds. Even after retirement, he found himself returning to the lake every January, not because he needed the work, because part of him simply belonged there. Standing at the shoreline, Samuel looked across the frozen surface and smiled gently. He remembered when nearly 300 workers had gathered here on mornings just like this. Back then, every inch of the lake had been carefully measured, straight guidelines stretched across the ice until it resembled an enormous checkerboard reaching toward the opposite shore. From a distance, it looked less like nature and more like an outdoor factory built entirely from winter itself. Today, only a few faded marks remained beneath the fresh snow. The lake had quietly reclaimed its silence. A young schoolteacher named Emily often brought her students to visit Samuel during these winter mornings. She believed history should be experienced rather than simply memorized from books. The children always arrived bundled beneath thick scarves and oversized wool hats, their boots crunching softly through the snow. Many had refrigerators at home. Some had never even seen an old-fashioned icebox. To them, harvesting ice from a frozen lake sounded almost unbelievable. "Did people really cut ice from here?" one little boy asked with wide eyes. Samuel laughed softly. "Oh, yes," he replied, "and not just enough for this town." He pointed toward the center of the lake. "Some of that ice traveled farther than any person standing here today." The children looked puzzled. Farther than people? How could frozen water travel around the world? Samuel knelt carefully beside them and began drawing lines in the snow. "This lake," he said, tracing a small circle. "Then Boston." Another line stretched across the white surface. Then ships. Another. The Caribbean. Another. India. The children stared in amazement. One little girl whispered quietly, "So winter visited India?" Samuel smiled. "I suppose it did." The answer sounded almost magical, yet it was completely true. The children imagined enormous sailing ships carrying pieces of their quiet hometown across oceans they had never seen. For a few moments, the frozen lake became something much larger than an ordinary pond. It became part of the whole world. Emily watched the conversation with quiet satisfaction. She knew facts alone rarely stay in a child's memory. Stories did. Long after the exact dates had been forgotten, these children probably remember the old man who told them that winter once sailed across the sea. Perhaps that single image would inspire someone to become a historian, or an engineer, or simply someone curious enough to ask how ordinary things become extraordinary. The old ice house nearby still stood, although time had not been especially gentle with it. Its wooden walls leaned slightly to one side. Several roof shingles had disappeared years earlier. Small plants pushed through cracks between the weathered boards each spring before winter covered them once again. Yet, despite its age, the building remained surprisingly sturdy. Samuel slowly pushed its heavy wooden door open. The hinges groaned softly after another long year of silence. Cold air drifted gently from inside, not because ice remained, those days were long over, but because the thick, insulated walls still performed the job they had been built to do nearly a century earlier. The children stepped inside. Their footsteps echoed across the empty wooden floor. "It's so big," one of them whispered. Samuel nodded. "You could stack thousands of tons of ice in here." The children tried imagining the empty building completely filled from floor to ceiling with enormous sparkling blocks. It seemed impossible. Emily smiled as she watched them look upward toward the high wooden beams. Sometimes empty buildings tell the greatest stories. You simply have to imagine what once filled them. Samuel pointed toward the far wall. That corner held the very first blocks each winter. He pointed somewhere else, and over there workers spread fresh sawdust between every layer. Another child looked confused. "Sawdust?" Samuel nodded again. "People think the secret was the ice," he chuckled. "But sometimes the real hero was the sawdust." The children laughed. History has a funny way of making ordinary things unexpectedly important. Outside, snowflakes had begun falling once more. Large, gentle flakes drifted silently from the gray afternoon sky. The frozen lake slowly disappeared beneath another fresh blanket of white. It looked exactly as it had before anyone ever imagined turning winter into one of the world's most valuable exports. Nature, patient as always, continued its endless rhythm. The people had changed, the businesses had changed, the inventions had changed, but winter remained wonderfully unchanged. And perhaps Samuel thought quietly as he looked across the lake one last time that afternoon, that was exactly how it should be.
The winter of 1934 arrived much like every winter before it. The first cold nights settled across New England sometime in late November. Small ponds froze first, then rivers slowed beneath growing sheets of ice. Finally, the larger lakes surrendered to the season, becoming wide fields of crystal stretching toward distant forests. To most people, it was simply another cold winter. To a handful of aging ice harvesters, however, it felt different. They couldn't explain exactly why. Perhaps it was because fewer workers returned each year. Perhaps it was because more houses now owned electric refrigerators than ever before. Or perhaps they simply sensed that time was carrying them toward the end of something much larger than themselves. Before sunrise on the first harvesting day, Samuel arrived at the old ice house carrying the same iron tongs he had owned for nearly 40 years. The wooden handles had become smooth from countless winters. The metal showed patches of rust despite careful maintenance. Like their owner, the tools had grown old with dignity. One by one, the other workers appeared through the darkness. There were only 23 men. Samuel remembered when more than 200 workers had stood in exactly the same place, waiting for dawn. The difference was impossible to ignore. No one mentioned it aloud. Some thoughts are understood without words. A faint orange glow slowly appeared above the eastern trees. The day was beginning. The foreman removed his thick gloves and knelt near the edge of the lake. He drilled a small inspection hole through the ice and carefully lowered a measuring stick into the opening. Everyone watched quietly. After a long moment, he smiled. 18 inches. A wave of quiet satisfaction spread through the group. The ice was thick, strong, perfect for harvesting. Even after all these years, hearing those words brought the same feeling of excitement that the workers had known since they were young boys. Some traditions never lose their magic. Soon, horses began pulling the familiar wooden marking plows across the frozen surface. Long, straight grooves appeared in the snow, stretching across the lake in neat rows. From above, the frozen landscape slowly transformed into an enormous checkerboard. Every square had been measured with remarkable precision. Every line had a purpose. The system had changed very little since the early 19th century. It had never needed to. When something works well, people often see little reason to reinvent it. The first saw entered the ice just after sunrise. Its sharp teeth scraped steadily through the frozen surface, sending tiny crystals sparkling into the morning air. The sound echoed across the quiet lake. Samuel paused for a moment. He closed his eyes. That sound, he had heard it every winter for most of his life. There was something strangely comforting about it. It reminded him of youth, of long days spent laughing beside friends who had long since passed away, of winters that had seemed endless, of mornings when the future felt as solid as the ice beneath his boots. One young reporter from a Boston newspaper arrived shortly after breakfast. He had heard rumors that this might be one of the final commercial ice harvests in the region. Notebook in hand, he carefully approached the workers. "Excuse me," he asked politely, "do you think this business has much future left?" Several men exchanged quiet glances. Finally, Samuel answered, "The future?" He smiled gently. "The future already belongs to those machines." The reporter looked surprised. "Then why are you still here?" Samuel looked across the frozen lake before replying, "Because some work deserves to be finished properly." The young journalist wrote every word carefully. Years later, that sentence would appear in a small article describing the final years of New England's natural ice trade.
It never became famous, yet for those who had lived through the industry's rise and fall, it captured something important. They knew they were witnessing the closing pages of a remarkable story. Still, there was work to do. The first block finally broke free. Using long iron poles, the workers gently guided it into a narrow water channel cut through the ice. One after another, hundreds of blocks followed. The floating rectangles moved slowly through the channel, like silent boats waiting their turn. At the edge of the lake, an old conveyor lifted each block toward the waiting ice house. The machinery groaned loudly. Its gears complained after another long winter. Yet it continued working, just as faithfully as the men operating it. Inside the warehouse, workers stacked each block with careful precision. Fresh sawdust filled every gap. Layer after layer slowly climbed toward the ceiling. Anyone entering the building would immediately notice the familiar smell: cold timber, fresh water, pine sawdust. It was the unmistakable scent of an American ice house. Samuel stood quietly watching younger workers perform tasks that had once belonged to his generation. There were fewer mistakes than he expected. Perhaps the old skills had not disappeared after all. Perhaps they had simply become rarer. Outside, snow began falling again. Large flakes drifted slowly through the still afternoon air, settling on the horses, the sleds, and the workers' heavy coats. The entire lake seemed wrapped in peaceful silence. Only the steady scrape of saws and the occasional call of the foreman interrupted the quiet. Looking across the frozen landscape, it became difficult to believe that this simple winter scene had once supported an industry worth millions of dollars. The lake asked for nothing. It simply froze. People had been the ones to discover its hidden value, and now people were the ones quietly walking away from it. As sunset painted the snow with soft shades of gold and pink, the first day's work finally ended. The men placed their tools neatly inside the old warehouse. Tomorrow, they would return before sunrise once again, not because they believed they could stop progress, but because some traditions deserve one final winter beneath the open sky.
The harvest had been completed just in time. Inside the old ice house, thousands of crystal-clear blocks rested quietly beneath thick layers of fresh sawdust. Outside, winter continued covering the countryside with fresh snow, as though nature herself wished to preserve the final days of an industry that had once amazed the entire world. Only a few days later, the ice began its next journey. Long before sunrise, heavy wagons rolled slowly toward the nearby railway station. Their wheels creaked beneath the enormous weight. Each wagon carried carefully stacked blocks wrapped in burlap and surrounded by fresh sawdust. The horses moved steadily through the cold morning air. Their breath rose like soft clouds into the darkness. For many of the older drivers, this route felt wonderfully familiar. Some had traveled it every winter for more than 30 years. Every bend in the road, every bridge, every small farmhouse. Each landmark carried memories of countless previous journeys. Nothing seemed very different, and yet almost everything had changed. At the railway station, workers carefully transferred the frozen cargo into specially insulated freight cars. The process demanded patience. If the blocks cracked while being moved, they would melt faster during the journey. Every movement remained slow and deliberate. Nobody hurried. Experience had taught them that calm hands usually accomplished more than hurried ones. The train departed shortly after dawn. Its whistle echoed across the snowy fields before disappearing into the distance. Inside the freight cars, Winter quietly traveled toward Boston one final time. Hours later, the train arrived beside the busy harbor. Boston looked much different than it had during the great years of the Ice Kingdom. Electric lights filled the streets. Automobiles moved where horse-drawn wagons had once dominated. Tall buildings overlooked the waterfront. Factories released gentle streams of smoke into the pale winter sky. Progress had arrived.
Yet hidden among the modern docks stood one small cargo ship waiting patiently for its unusual load. Her name was Margaret Ann. She was not especially large, nor particularly famous, but she represented the final chapter of an extraordinary tradition. Dock workers opened the insulated freight cars one by one. Cold air drifted into the harbor as the first blocks appeared. Even after days of travel, they remained beautifully clear. Sunlight passing through them created tiny rainbows across the wooden docks. Several young dock workers paused for a moment simply to admire them. One smiled quietly. "I've never seen lake ice this clear before." An older worker nodded. "It won't be around much longer." The younger man looked surprised. "You really think this is the end?" The older dock worker shrugged gently. "I think the world has already made up its mind." Neither man spoke again. Sometimes silence says enough. Loading the ship required remarkable organization. Each block had to fit tightly beside the next. Empty spaces meant warmer air. Warmer air meant faster melting. Fresh sawdust filled every small gap. Layer after layer slowly disappeared into the cargo hold until the entire ship seemed filled with nothing but frozen winter. Standing on the dock, Captain William Harris quietly watched his crew finish their work. He had spent nearly 40 years commanding ships carrying natural ice. He had crossed the Caribbean dozens of times, visited Havana more often than he could remember, sailed through storms that nearly destroyed his vessel, watched thousands of tons of frozen cargo survive journeys that many people once believed impossible. Now he wondered if this might be his final ice voyage. He placed one hand gently against the wooden railing. The smooth timber had grown familiar beneath his fingers. Ships become companions after enough years together. Just before departure, a newspaper photographer arrived carrying an enormous camera balanced carefully on a wooden tripod. He asked the captain if he might photograph the crew beside their cargo. Everyone agreed. The men gathered quietly near the ship's gangway. Some removed their hats, others folded their arms. Nobody smiled very much, not because they were unhappy. Photography simply felt serious in those days. The camera clicked. For one brief instant, time stood perfectly still. Years later, historians would discover that photograph inside an old newspaper archive. It would become one of the last known images of a commercial natural ice shipment leaving Boston Harbor. At the time, however, nobody thought much about it. It was simply another photograph, another ordinary workday. History often hides inside moments that seem completely unremarkable. The ship's whistle finally sounded, deep, slow, almost thoughtful. Heavy ropes were untied. The vessel drifted gently away from the dock before turning toward the open sea. Snowflakes continued falling as Boston slowly disappeared behind her. Captain Harris remained on deck long after the harbor faded from sight. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before him. Somewhere far to the south, warmer waters waited. So did familiar ports, old customers, and perhaps a few people who still preferred natural lake ice over the cold produced by humming machines. He wondered how many more years those customers would remain. 5, perhaps 10? Probably not much longer. The world was changing too quickly now. Below deck, thousands of frozen blocks rested quietly beneath their blankets of sawdust. They had begun life on a peaceful New England lake only a few weeks ago. Soon, they would cool drinks beneath tropical sunshine. It was the same remarkable journey that Frederic Tudor had imagined a century before. Even now, after all those years, the idea still felt wonderfully improbable. Winter sailing towards summer, nature traveling across the sea, a frozen lake becoming an international traveler. The ship continued southward beneath a sky filled with quiet winter clouds. Behind her, Boston slowly disappeared behind her horizon. Ahead waited warmer winds, and with them, one final reminder that even the most extraordinary journeys eventually reach their peaceful end. The sea had been unusually calm. For nearly 2 weeks, the Margaret Ann crossed the Atlantic beneath clear blue skies, carried southward by steady winds that had guided sailing ships for centuries. Every morning, Captain William Harris followed the same familiar routine. Before breakfast, he walked quietly across the deck while most of the crew still slept. The Caribbean sunrise always arrived differently from the pale mornings of New England. Instead of soft gray clouds drifting above snowy forests, brilliant shades of orange and gold slowly spread across endless tropical waters. Flying fish occasionally leaped beside the ship. Seabirds circled overhead. The warm breeze carried the unmistakable scent of salt and distant islands. It was beautiful, yet every degree of warmth reminded Captain Harris of the precious cargo resting below his feet. Hidden deep inside the insulated hold, thousands of blocks of natural lake ice continued their slow battle against the tropical climate. The crew rarely opened the cargo hatch. They had learned long ago that curiosity could become expensive. Each unnecessary inspection allowed warm air to enter. Instead, they trusted the careful packing done weeks earlier in Boston. Sawdust remained their silent partner, protecting winter one final time. Late one afternoon, a sailor climbed the forward mast with his brass telescope. Only a few moments later, his cheerful voice drifted across the deck. "Land ahead!" Several crew members smiled. After days surrounded by nothing but open water, even experienced sailors welcomed the first distant outline of land. Slowly, the coastline of Cuba appeared through the afternoon haze. Palm trees lined the shore. White buildings shimmered beneath the bright sunshine. Beyond them stood the busy harbor of Havana. For Captain Harris, the sight awakened decades of memories. He remembered arriving here as a young officer when the natural ice trade stood at the height of its success. Back then, every arrival had been an event. Dock workers hurried toward the ship before it even reached the pier. Merchants waited impatiently beside enormous warehouses. Hotel owners argued playfully over whose delivery should be unloaded first. The city had eagerly welcomed every piece of frozen New England winter. Today, however, the harbor looked different, much different. As the Margaret Ann approached her usual dock, Captain Harris noticed something standing beside one of the old icehouse warehouses, a modern brick building. Tall chimneys stretched into the sky. Large steel pipes disappeared through its walls. Small clouds of steam drifted upward into the warm afternoon air. He didn't need anyone to explain what it was. A refrigeration plant, one of several recently built throughout the city. Quietly, efficiently, without needing a single frozen lake. The captain remained silent as the ship eased gently against the wooden dock. Heavy ropes were secured. The voyage had ended. A few dock workers approached, far fewer than he remembered. Most greeted Captain Harris warmly. Some had known him for nearly 30 years. One elderly dock worker named Miguel removed his hat and smiled. "You still bring us winter." Captain Harris laughed softly. "For now." Miguel looked toward the new refrigeration plant. "For now," he repeated. Neither man needed to say anything more. Both understood exactly what those words meant. Unloading began shortly afterward. The heavy hatch slowly opened. A refreshing wave of cool air escaped into the afternoon tropical. Several younger workers instinctively stepped closer. Even after refrigeration had become common, there remained something wonderfully satisfying about feeling genuine winter emerge from the belly of a ship. One by one, enormous blocks rose toward the dock. Despite their long journey, they remained remarkably clear. Sunlight passed through them like crystal. Children watching from nearby streets gathered along the harbor fence. Many had never seen natural lake ice before. One little girl tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Where did it come from?" He pointed toward the north. "From America." She looked puzzled. "But it's winter there?" Her father smiled. It was. The child stared at the sparkling block as though it had arrived from another planet. Perhaps, in a way, it had. Nearby stood the old Havana ice warehouse. Captain Harris remembered when every corner of the building overflowed with frozen cargo. Now, nearly half the storage rooms stood empty. The manager greeted him with genuine affection. His name was Ricardo Alvarez. Time had added silver to his hair, but his smile remained unchanged. "You've come again, my friend," Captain Harris nodded. "I couldn't stay away." Ricardo laughed quietly. "Neither could I." The two old friends walked slowly through the warehouse together. Large wooden beams stretched high above them. The familiar smell of damp timber and sawdust still lingered in the cool air. Yet the silence felt different. Years earlier, dozens of workers would have filled the building. Now, only a handful carefully stacked the remaining shipments. Ricardo finally stopped beside one of the windows overlooking the harbor. From there, both men could clearly see the new refrigeration factory. "It works every day," Ricardo said quietly. "Summer or winter." Captain Harris nodded. "I know. It doesn't wait for frozen lakes." "No." "It never worries about storms at sea." "No." Ricardo smiled gently. "I suppose progress rarely asks our opinion." Captain Harris looked back toward the rows of beautiful natural ice sparkling inside the warehouse. "No," he answered softly, "it simply arrives." For several minutes, neither man spoke. Sometimes old friends understand silence better than conversation. Outside, Havana continued moving forward into a new age. Automobiles passed along busy streets. Electric lights brightened shop windows as evening approached. Inside restaurants, mechanical refrigerators quietly hummed where enormous ice boxes had once stood. Customers noticed little difference. Their drinks remained cold, their desserts stayed frozen. Life simply continued. That, perhaps, was the greatest sign that history had changed. The miracle had become ordinary. As sunset painted the Caribbean sky with deep shades of orange and crimson, Captain Harris walked once more along the quiet dock before returning to his ship. He paused for one final look at the old warehouse. For decades, that building had represented one of the most extraordinary trade routes on Earth. Frozen lakes to tropical islands, winter to endless summer. It sounded almost impossible, yet countless ordinary people had made it real. Tomorrow, the Margaret Ann would begin her journey back to Boston. Perhaps she would carry another cargo of natural ice next winter. Perhaps not. No one could say for certain. But tonight, beneath the warm Caribbean sky, Captain Harris allowed himself one quiet moment of gratitude. He had witnessed history's strangest industry from beginning to end, and somehow that felt like enough.
Boston, Massachusetts, winter 1935. Inside one of the city's oldest ice warehouses, merchants, hotel owners, restaurant managers, and longtime buyers gather for what may become Boston's final major auction of natural lake ice. Snow falls gently outside as the echoes of an industry begin to fade. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Boston Harbor looked peaceful. The masts of cargo ships swayed gently beside the docks, while thin curls of smoke drifted from nearby factories into the pale winter sky. For generations, mornings like this had marked another busy day for the natural ice business. Today felt different, not because the weather had changed, but because everyone attending the annual ice auction quietly sensed that history was approaching the end of another chapter. The old warehouse on Commercial Street had hosted these auctions for nearly 70 years. Its enormous timber beams had watched fortunes rise and fall. Merchants from distant cities had gathered beneath the same roof every winter, carefully inspecting crystal-clear blocks harvested from New England's frozen lakes. Some buyers represented elegant hotels. Others supplied restaurants, hospitals, fishing companies, breweries, and railway depots. There had been a time when finding enough ice for everyone seemed almost impossible. Now the challenge was different, finding enough customers.
Inside the warehouse, rows of polished ice blocks reflected the soft morning light filtering through narrow windows. Even after decades, their beauty remained remarkable. Every block appeared almost perfectly transparent. Tiny air bubbles shimmered deep inside, like stars trapped beneath frozen glass. Visitors often paused simply to admire them. Natural lake ice possessed a quiet elegance that machines struggled to imitate. By 9 o'clock, the first buyers began arriving. Heavy boots echoed across the wooden floor. Old friends greeted one another warmly. Many had spent their entire working lives together. Business competitors, perhaps, but companions as well. Shared winters create lasting friendships. Near the entrance stood Samuel. Although officially retired, he had accepted an invitation to attend one final auction. Several younger merchants recognized him immediately. They shook his hand with genuine respect. "Good to see you again, San." "You too. Still visiting the old lakes?" Samuel smiled. "Every January." "I suppose you always will." He nodded quietly. "Some places become part of who we are." The auctioneer climbed onto a small wooden platform at precisely 10 o'clock. His voice had filled the warehouse every winter for more than 30 years. Even today, it carried the same calm confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conversations slowly faded. "We'll begin with lot number 1. Workers uncovered the first stack of beautiful crystal-clear ice. The blocks glowed beneath the warehouse lights. For a brief moment, the room looked almost magical. Bidding began. The voices sounded familiar, yet noticeably quieter than years before. Prices remained reasonable. No frantic competition, no desperate offers. Many buyers already owned mechanical refrigeration systems. Natural ice had become something of a specialty product, still respected, still appreciated, simply no longer essential. During a short break, Samuel wandered toward one corner of the warehouse where several old photographs decorated the wall. One image immediately caught his attention. It showed the very same building almost 50 years earlier. Hundreds of workers filled every available space. Horse-drawn wagons waited outside. Stacks of ice reached nearly to the ceiling. The warehouse had seemed almost too small to contain such extraordinary activity. Samuel smiled softly. He could still remember that day. He had been only 17 years old, strong enough to carry almost anything, certain that the future would look exactly like the present. Life has a gentle way of teaching otherwise. Nearby, 2 young businessmen studied the photographs with curiosity. One pointed toward the crowded image. Were there really that many workers? Samuel stepped beside them. There were. More? Samuel nodded. On busy winters, you could barely hear yourself think inside this building. He chuckled quietly. The noise never seemed to bother anyone. What was it like? Samuel took a slow breath before answering. It felt... He searched for the right words. Like everyone believed winter would last forever. The younger men remained silent. Neither of them had grown up during those great years. To them, the photographs already belonged to history. After lunch, bidding resumed throughout the afternoon. By now, many of the older merchants seemed less interested in business than conversation. They shared stories about impossible voyages, warm winters, memorable storms, cargoes that somehow survived journeys everyone expected to fail. Each memory added another small piece to the history of the Ice Kingdom. One elderly hotel owner laughed while recalling his first shipment from Boston nearly 40 years ago. It arrived in August. Someone smiled. Did much of it survive? He grinned. Enough to convince every guest in the hotel that I performed miracles. The room filled with gentle laughter. Stories had gradually replaced profits as the day's most valuable currency. Outside, snow continued falling across the quiet harbor. Children hurried home from school, wrapped in thick winter coats. Most never glanced toward the old warehouse. Few realized the remarkable history resting behind its weathered wooden walls. To them, refrigeration had always existed. Cooled belonged inside kitchens, not inside sailing ships crossing tropical oceans. Late in the afternoon, the auctioneer announced the last lot. Silence settled across the room. Everyone understood the significance of the moment. The last stack of natural lake ice slowly disappeared beneath a modest winning bid. The auctioneer placed his small wooden hammer gently on the table. Sold. For several seconds, nobody moved. It was only another business transaction, yet somehow it felt much larger. Not because natural ice would disappear tomorrow, it wouldn't. A few companies would continue harvesting for years. Some remote communities would rely upon frozen lakes even longer. But everyone understood something deeper. The age when natural ice stood at the center of international commerce had quietly come to an end. As buyers prepared to leave, the warehouse gradually emptied. Boots echoed one final time across the old wooden floor. Coats were buttoned, hats adjusted, handshakes lingered a little longer than usual. Outside, Samuel paused before stepping into the falling snow. He looked back at the warehouse. The same building had once represented the beating heart of an industry that connected frozen lakes to tropical cities across the globe. Now it stood peacefully beneath another New England winter. Its work, at last, was nearly finished. Snowflakes settled gently upon the empty dock. The harbor remained wonderfully quiet. Samuel smiled one last time before walking slowly toward home. Winter would always return, whether people harvested it or not, and perhaps that was the most comforting thought of all.
The morning arrived in complete silence. Fresh snow had fallen throughout the night, covering every fence, rooftop, and pine tree with a smooth blanket of white. Even before sunrise, the countryside seemed unusually peaceful. There was no sound of wagons, no distant whistles from railway stations, no voices carrying across frozen fields, only the quiet whisper of a cold January wind drifting over the sleeping landscape. Samuel woke earlier than usual. Old habits often remain long after work has disappeared. For more than 60 winters, he had risen before dawn whenever the lakes were frozen. His body still remembered those mornings, even though there was no harvest waiting outside. He dressed slowly. The heavy wool coat felt just as familiar as it had decades before. His thick leather boots had been repaired so many times that it was difficult to remember which parts were original. His knitted gloves had been made by his wife many years earlier. Although she was no longer alive, Samuel still wore them every winter. Some memories are carried not only in the heart, but also in the simple objects we refuse to replace. As he stepped outside, he noticed a small figure waiting beside the front gate. It was his grandson, Thomas. Only 10 years old, Thomas had been asking questions about the old ice trade ever since visiting the abandoned ice house with his school. "Are we still going?" the boy asked quietly. Samuel smiled. "I wouldn't miss it." Together, they began walking toward the lake. The narrow country road was almost hidden beneath fresh snow. Each step left a crisp footprint that stretched behind them like a small trail through time. Thomas looked around with wide eyes. "It's so quiet." Samuel nodded. "It wasn't always." "What was it like?" Samuel laughed softly. "Oh, where do I begin?" He pointed toward an open field. Horses waited there. A little farther ahead, workers sharpened their saws beside those trees. Then toward the frozen lake itself, and by sunrise, there would already be hundreds of men standing out there. Thomas tried to imagine it. The empty lake before him suddenly became crowded inside his imagination. Long rows of horses, men pulling heavy saws, stacks of shining ice, voices calling across the frozen surface. The silence around him somehow made those invisible memories feel even stronger. When they finally reached the shoreline, Samuel stopped walking. The lake stretched endlessly before them, smooth, white, perfectly still.
It looked exactly as it had the first morning Samuel ever worked there as a young boy. Nature, he realized, had aged far more gracefully than people. Thomas noticed several old wooden posts sticking through the snow near the shoreline. "What are those?" Samuel smiled. "Guide markers." What did they guide? The first cutting lines. He carefully brushed snow away from one weathered post. When the harvest began, every row of ice had to be perfectly straight. Thomas touched the frozen wood. "So these are really from the old days." Samuel nodded. "They've been standing here longer than your father has been alive." The boy looked at them with quiet respect. It suddenly felt as though history had become something real instead of merely stories in books. They stepped carefully onto the frozen lake. The ice was thick, solid beneath their feet. Samuel walked more slowly now. Age had taught him to appreciate careful movements. Years earlier, he could have crossed this lake carrying a block of ice on one shoulder without stopping to rest. Now, every step required patience. Yet somehow, the slower pace made the morning feel even more peaceful. Halfway across the lake, Samuel finally stopped. This was the center. The center of what? The busiest place on the whole lake. Thomas looked around. "But there's nothing here." Samuel smiled gently. "Exactly. You see, history doesn't always leave buildings behind. Sometimes it leaves empty places." Thomas frowned slightly, trying to understand. Samuel continued, "If you only look with your eyes, you'll see snow. But if you learn to look with your imagination," he paused, "you'll see hundreds of people working together." Thomas closed his eyes. For a few moments, he tried. He imagined horses moving across the frozen surface, the scrape of long iron saws, workers laughing while brushing snow from another row of ice. The sound felt almost real. When he opened his eyes again, the lake was quiet once more. "I think I heard them." Samuel smiled warmly. "So do I." The old man removed a small object from his coat pocket. It was an old iron ice marker. Its surface had become dark with age. The wooden handle was smooth after decades of use. "I've carried this tool since I was 16. Thomas held it carefully. "It doesn't look very special." Samuel laughed. "Most important things don't." He looked across the endless white lake. This little iron tool helped measure ice that traveled to Cuba. It helped send winter to India. It helped build a business that people once believed was impossible. Thomas examined the simple piece of iron more closely. It suddenly seemed much more valuable than before. "Will you keep it?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "No." He gently placed the tool into Thomas's hands. "Now it's your turn." The boy was surprised. "But I'm never going to harvest ice." "I know. Then why do you want me to have it?" Samuel looked toward the rising sun. "Because one day, someone will ask if these stories were true. I want there to be someone who can answer yes." Thomas held the old tool tightly. For the first time, he understood that history was not only something written in books. Sometimes it was something passed quietly from one pair of hands to another. They remained standing together as the first sunlight spread across the frozen lake. Thousands of tiny crystals sparkled like diamonds beneath the morning sky. It was breathtakingly beautiful. Samuel took one long, quiet breath. "This," he whispered, "this is exactly how I want to remember it. Not crowded, not noisy, not busy, just peaceful." The lake had given him an entire lifetime of memories. Now it deserved to rest. As grandfather and grandson slowly walked back toward the snowy shoreline, two sets of footprints stretched quietly behind them. One belonged to a man whose journey was almost complete. The other belonged to a boy whose own story was only just beginning. Neither of them knew it then, but that quiet winter morning would become one of the memories Thomas would treasure for the rest of his life.
Nearly 30 years had passed since that quiet winter morning when Samuel and young Thomas walked together across the frozen lake. The world had changed beyond anything Samuel could have imagined. Television had entered living rooms. Jet airplanes crossed oceans in only a few hours.
Highways connected cities that once seemed impossibly far apart. Every home now seemed to have an electric refrigerator quietly humming in the kitchen. Children grew up believing that ice simply appeared whenever someone opened the freezer door. Very few stopped to wonder where that everyday miracle had begun. Thomas often did. Now in his early 40s, he had become a history teacher at a nearby school. His students usually expected lessons about famous presidents, great wars, or ancient civilizations. Instead, Thomas often surprised them with stories about ordinary people. He believed history belonged just as much to workers, farmers, sailors, and craftsmen as it did to kings and generals. Whenever winter arrived, he always found himself thinking about his grandfather. Sometimes he could almost hear Samuel's calm voice carried softly through the cold morning air. History doesn't always leave buildings behind. Sometimes it leaves empty places. Those words had remained with Thomas for the rest of his life. One bright autumn afternoon, he parked his small family car beside a narrow country road. His young daughter Emily looked curiously through the window. "Is this where Grandpa Samuel used to work?" Thomas smiled warmly. "It is. But I thought you said everything disappeared." "Most of it did." He pointed toward a weathered wooden building standing proudly beside the lake. "But not all of it." During the previous decade, local residents had worked together to save the old ice house from collapse. Several retired carpenters donated their time. Local businesses contributed lumber and roofing materials. The Town Historical Society raised enough money to repair the building without changing its original appearance. Nobody expected to earn money from it. They simply believed the story deserved a home. Above the entrance hung a modest wooden sign, "The New England Ice Museum." The letters had been carefully carved by hand. Nothing flashy, nothing modern, just a quiet invitation to remember. Emily hurried toward the entrance, while Thomas followed more slowly. The heavy wooden door creaked gently as they stepped inside. Immediately, the temperature felt cooler, not because the building still stored ice, it didn't, but the thick, insulated walls continued doing exactly what they had been designed to do nearly a century earlier. The smell was familiar. Old timber, dry pine, a faint trace of sawdust. Thomas stopped walking for a moment. He closed his eyes. For just an instant, he was 10 years old again. He could almost see Samuel standing beside the empty walls, explaining how thousands of frozen blocks had once filled the enormous building from floor to ceiling. Memory has a remarkable way of borrowing familiar places. A cheerful museum guide approached them with a friendly smile. "Welcome. Have you visited before?" Thomas nodded gently. "A very long time ago." The guide smiled. "Then you've come home." Those simple words somehow felt exactly right. Inside the museum stood dozens of carefully preserved tools. Long iron saws stretched across one wall. Heavy ice tongs rested beside polished wooden sled runners. Old leather shoulder pads hung from wooden hooks, exactly as workers had left them decades earlier. Each object carried small handwritten labels explaining how it had once been used. Emily stopped beside a pair of enormous ice tongs. "They're so heavy." Thomas nodded. "Imagine carrying a 100-pound block of ice with those." She looked at him with wide eyes. "I don't think I could." He laughed. "Neither could I." Nearby stood an old black and white photograph nearly 6 feet wide. It showed hundreds of workers standing proudly on the frozen lake. Rows of horses waited patiently beside enormous stacks of crystal-clear ice. Emily stared at the photograph for a long time. Were there really this many people? There were. They all worked here? Thomas nodded. For many winters, this lake was one of the busiest places in New England. Emily looked back through the nearby window toward the peaceful lake outside. It seemed impossible. The silence beyond the glass revealed nothing of its remarkable past. Toward the center of the museum stood a glass display case. Inside rested a small collection of personal belongings donated by former ice harvesters. a worn leather lunch pail, a faded wool cap, several handwritten shipping records, an old brass pocket watch. Then Thomas suddenly stopped walking. Inside the final display case rested an object he recognized immediately, an iron ice marker, nearly identical to the one Samuel had given him all those years ago. He instinctively reached into his coat pocket. Carefully wrapped inside a soft cloth remained his grandfather's original tool. He still carried it whenever he visited the lake, not because he needed it, simply because it reminded him that some stories should never be forgotten. Emily noticed him holding the old marker. "Is that Grandpa Samuel's?" Thomas smiled quietly. "Yes." "Will it always stay with you?" He looked thoughtfully toward the museum display, then back toward the old tool resting in his hands. Finally, he answered, "No." Emily looked surprised. "No?" "One day. One day it will belong to you." She held it carefully. It felt surprisingly heavy, not only because of the iron, but because of everything it represented. 3 generations, 1 frozen lake, 1 impossible dream. As afternoon sunlight drifted through the narrow windows, tiny beams of golden light illuminated floating specks of sawdust still resting high among the wooden rafters. For a brief moment, it almost seemed as though the building itself remembered. Outside, the quiet lake reflected the clear autumn sky. Children played nearby without realizing they were running across ground once filled with horses, sleds, and thousands of workers harvesting winter itself. History had become peaceful. Its busiest days had ended, but its story continued, not through great monuments, not through enormous statues, but through ordinary people willing to remember. As Thomas and Emily stepped outside, the afternoon breeze gently stirred the trees surrounding the old ice house. Thomas looked back one final time. The building stood proudly beside the lake, no longer protecting blocks of frozen water, now protecting something even more valuable: memory. And perhaps that was the greatest purpose it could ever serve.
The world has become wonderfully quiet. Not because people have stopped inventing, not because progress has slowed, but because the greatest inventions often become so familiar that we barely notice them anymore. On an ordinary evening, somewhere in the modern world, a family gathers inside a warm kitchen. Outside, rain taps gently against the windows. Inside, dinner is almost ready. Someone opens the refrigerator. A cool breath of air quietly escapes. A bottle of milk is lifted from the shelf. Fresh vegetables wait patiently inside a drawer. A small tray of ice cubes rests in the freezer above. Nothing about the moment seems remarkable. No one pauses to admire the refrigerator. No one wonders how the cold arrived there. No one thinks about frozen lakes hundreds of miles away. It is simply another ordinary evening. And perhaps that is the greatest success any invention can achieve. When something becomes so dependable that it disappears into everyday life, it has truly changed the world. Every quiet hum from a refrigerator carries the distant echo of another sound: the scrape of long iron saws crossing a frozen lake. Every handful of ice cubes reflects sunlight just as the great blocks of New England once reflected the pale winter sky. Every refrigerated truck traveling through the night follows a path first imagined by people who believed cold itself could travel. The machines have changed. The purpose has not. Even today, enormous refrigerated ships cross the oceans every single day. Instead of carrying natural ice, they transport fruit, medicine, seafood, flowers, and countless other goods that depend on carefully controlled temperatures. The technology has become astonishingly advanced. Computers monitor every degree. Sensors report tiny changes before people even notice them.
Engines quietly create winter wherever it is needed. Yet beneath all that modern engineering lives the same simple idea: move cold, protect what matters. It is the very same idea Frederic Tudor imagined when standing beside a frozen New England pond more than 2 centuries ago. Many people remember famous inventors because their machines still bear their names. Others remember great explorers because maps celebrate their journeys. Frederic Tudor belongs to a quieter category of history. He changed the world without most people realizing that he had done so. His greatest achievement was not selling ice. It was teaching humanity that cold itself could become part of global commerce. Once people accepted that impossible idea, everything else slowly followed. Mechanical refrigeration, cold storage warehouses, refrigerated rail cars, modern supermarkets, medical refrigeration, frozen food, international food supply chains. Each new invention built upon the foundations laid by countless ordinary workers harvesting frozen lakes every winter. History rarely moves in giant leaps. More often, it advances through thousands of small steps, each one quietly supporting the next. Perhaps that is why the Ice Kingdom remains such a remarkable story. It reminds us that progress is usually a shared achievement. One dream inspires another. One solution creates new possibilities. One generation prepares the path for those who come after. Samuel understood that. He never considered himself important. To him, he had simply done his work. He harvested ice, loaded wagons, helped fill warehouses. Nothing more. Yet without people like Samuel, there would have been no Ice Kingdom. Without the Ice Kingdom, the road toward modern refrigeration might have looked very different. Ordinary lives often leave extraordinary footprints. Thomas understood that lesson as well. Long after Samuel was gone, he continued telling the story. Not because he wanted people to admire the past, but because he wanted people to notice the hidden history surrounding everyday life. A simple glass of cold water, a scoop of ice cream, fresh fruit in the middle of winter, medicine safely preserved until it was needed. None of these conveniences appeared by accident. Each one carries the quiet work of generations who solved problems one careful step at a time. Outside, winter continues arriving every year. Across New England, lakes still freeze beneath silent skies. Snow still settles gently upon pine forests. The wind still drifts across crystal clear ice exactly as it did hundreds of years ago. Nature has changed very little. It patiently repeats the same rhythm year after year. Freeze, rest, melt, begin again. People, meanwhile, continue finding new ways to live alongside that rhythm. Some winters are colder, some are warmer. Some lakes freeze thick enough to walk across, others remain open beneath gray skies. The seasons continue without hurry, without concern for human plans. Perhaps that is one of nature's greatest lessons. Everything changes, yet everything continues. The Ice Kingdom rose, the Ice Kingdom faded, but winter remained, and so did the ideas born from it. If you ever find yourself standing beside a quiet frozen lake on a peaceful morning, take a moment to listen. Not because you will hear workers calling across the ice, those voices have long since faded. Not because horses will pull sleds through the snow, their tracks disappeared generations ago. Listen because silence has its own stories. The wind remembers. The water remembers. The frozen surface still reflects the same sky that Frederic Tudor once looked upon when he imagined something impossible. Most people saw only winter. He saw opportunity. Most people saw frozen water. He saw a bridge connecting continents. Sometimes, history changes because one person asks a simple question that nobody else thinks to ask. What if? What if winter could travel? What if cold could become a product? What if an impossible idea wasn't impossible after all? Those questions transformed a quiet New England lake into the center of one of history's most unusual industries, not through magic, not through luck, but through patience, persistence, and the quiet determination to keep believing after everyone else had stopped. Tonight, somewhere in the world, millions of people will place a few ice cubes into a glass without giving them a second thought. The gentle clink will last only a moment, then life will continue. But hidden inside that ordinary sound lives an extraordinary history. A history of frozen lakes, wooden ice houses, horse-drawn sleds, ocean voyages, countless hard-working hands, and one dream that refused to melt. As our journey finally comes to its peaceful end, we return once more to that quiet New England lake. The snow falls softly. The trees stand patiently around the shoreline. The water sleeps beneath a blanket of ice. Nothing asks to be remembered. Nothing asks to become famous. It simply exists, calm, silent, timeless. Perhaps that is the perfect ending. Not a grand celebration, not a dramatic farewell, just the gentle understanding that the greatest changes in history often begin in the quietest places. A frozen pond, a determined dreamer, a handful of ordinary people, and an idea that would one day cool the entire world. So, as the evening grows a little darker and the stars slowly appear above the sleeping lake, thank you for walking this remarkable journey through one of history's most forgotten kingdoms. May your evening be peaceful. May your curiosity never fade. And the next time a single ice cube settles gently into your glass, perhaps you'll smile, knowing that its story began long before electricity, long before refrigerators, on a quiet winter morning beside a frozen lake in New England. Good night.
Winter had always arrived with remarkable confidence. For generations, the people of New England rarely questioned its schedule. By late November, the first frosts decorated the fields. December covered the forests with snow. And sometime during January, the lakes transformed into enormous mirrors of crystal, waiting patiently beneath pale winter skies. It had happened for centuries. People trusted it completely. Yet the winter of 1950 seemed strangely uncertain. December arrived, but the lakes remained mostly open. Thin sheets of ice appeared along the shore during the coldest nights, only to disappear beneath warmer afternoons. The fishermen noticed first. They waited longer than usual before walking onto the frozen water. Old farmers quietly shook their heads while studying the weather. Something felt unfamiliar. No one considered it alarming, not yet, only unusual. Morning after morning, mist drifted gently across the surface of the lake where thick winter ice had once stretched from one shoreline to the other. The water remained dark and restless. Small waves rolled quietly beneath gray clouds. The lake looked more like late autumn than midwinter. For many younger residents, it meant very little. Life had changed. The town no longer depended on frozen lakes. Every grocery store owned electric refrigeration. Every hospital had reliable cooling equipment. Even fishing boats carried modern insulated storage. Whether the lake froze or not no longer determined the local economy. But for the older generation, the sight stirred something deeper. Samuel was no longer alive. Several years had passed since his peaceful final walk across the frozen lake with young Thomas. Yet many people who had worked beside him still lived nearby. On cold mornings, some of them continued visiting the lakes almost out of habit, not because they expected work, simply because those places still felt like home. One such visitor was Jacob Miller. Now nearly 80 years old, Jacob had spent more than 40 winters harvesting natural ice before mechanical refrigeration quietly replaced the trade. Every Monday morning, he walked the same narrow path leading toward the old ice house. He carried no tools, only a walking stick carved from maple wood many years earlier. When he reached the shoreline, he stopped. The lake remained unfrozen. Jacob stood silently for several minutes. The wind gently stirred the water. A pair of ducks floated peacefully across the surface. Finally, he smiled to himself. The lake knows what it's doing. There was no disappointment in his voice, only quiet acceptance. Nature had never promised to repeat itself exactly. It simply followed its own rhythm. Nearby stood the old ice house. The building had survived another winter. Its weathered wooden walls remained strong. Snow rested lightly upon the roof. Inside, everything stood perfectly still. No towering stacks of crystal-clear ice, no fresh pine sawdust covering the floor, no workers laughing during their morning break, only silence. Sunlight slipped gently through narrow gaps between the wooden boards, creating long golden beams across the empty interior. Dust floated slowly through the light. The building seemed almost asleep. Jacob stepped inside. His footsteps echoed softly against the old timber walls. He removed his gloves and rested one hand upon one of the enormous support beams. The wood felt cold, solid, unchanged. He closed his eyes. Immediately, memory filled the silence. He imagined dozens of workers lifting heavy ice blocks onto wooden platforms. The steady scrape of iron tongs echoed once more. Someone called instructions from the loading platform. Horses stamped impatiently outside while waiting for another wagon. For a brief moment, the building breathed again. Then Jacob opened his eyes. Only empty space remained. He smiled gently. Perhaps buildings remember, or perhaps people simply carry enough memories to make old places feel alive. Outside, light snow finally began falling. Large flakes drifted lazily toward the ground. Children hurried outside laughing, hoping enough snow might arrive for sledding. To them, winter remained magical regardless of how thick the ice became. History always belongs differently to each generation. For some, the lake represented work. For others, adventure. For still others, simply beauty. Later that afternoon, Thomas arrived with several of his history students. He had promised to show them the old harvesting grounds before spring returned. The students looked surprised. "I thought the lake would be frozen." Thomas smiled. "So did many people." One student quietly asked, "Does it make you sad?" Thomas thought carefully before answering, "No. Why not?" He looked across the open water. Because the story was never really about the ice. It was about the people. The lake gave them an opportunity. They turned it into something extraordinary. The students remained quiet. Thomas continued, "One winter doesn't erase 200 years of history. It simply reminds us that nature writes its own schedule." As evening slowly approached, the clouds finally parted. The setting sun reflected beautifully across the open water, turning the lake into a sheet of shimmering gold. It was breathtaking, not because it resembled the past, but because it reminded everyone that nature never stops creating beauty, sometimes with ice, sometimes without it. As darkness gently settled over the quiet countryside, the old ice house stood patiently beside the lake, no longer waiting for workers, no longer waiting for wagons, simply watching another winter pass. It had witnessed prosperity, innovation, hardship, change, and now it quietly witnessed peace. Perhaps that was enough, because every great story eventually reaches a moment where nothing more needs to be built, nothing more needs to be harvested, nothing more needs to be proven. Sometimes the greatest ending is simply watching the seasons continue, exactly as they always have. The old ice house had stood for nearly 100 years. It had survived harsh winters, heavy snowstorms, powerful spring floods, summer heat, and decades of quiet neglect before local historians finally decided to preserve it. Every beam inside the building seemed to carry its own memory. Every floorboard creaked with stories no one had heard for generations. That summer, a small restoration crew worked patiently to strengthen the aging structure. Nothing dramatic, no major reconstruction. Their goal was simple: protect the building without changing its character. Old places deserve to grow old gracefully. On a warm Tuesday morning, carpenter Robert Collins noticed something unusual. Several floorboards near the back wall felt slightly loose. He knelt carefully beside them and gently removed the old iron nails. The wood lifted surprisingly easily. Beneath the boards lay a layer of dry sawdust that had not been disturbed for decades. Robert smiled. "Looks like nobody has been down here in a very long time." The museum director walked over. "What did you find?" Robert carefully brushed away the sawdust with his hands. At first, nothing. Then, the corner of a small wooden box slowly appeared beneath the dust. The men exchanged curious glances. Working together, they carefully lifted it into the light. It was a cedar chest, only about 2 feet long. Its brass hinges had become dark with age. A tiny rusted lock still hung from the front, although time had already broken it long ago. Nobody spoke. Some discoveries seemed to ask for silence. Robert gently opened the lid. Inside rested several bundles wrapped carefully in faded cloth. Old papers, small notebooks, a leather journal, dozens of folded letters tied neatly together with worn pieces of blue ribbon. The paper had turned yellow with age, yet remarkably, everything remained dry. The thick walls of the ice house had quietly protected these forgotten memories for almost 90 years. The museum director carefully unfolded the first letter. The handwriting flowed elegantly across the page. It was dated January 17th, 1886. The room became perfectly still. No one hurried. History had waited nearly a century. It deserved another few quiet minutes. The letter began simply, "My dear Anna." It had been written by an ordinary ice worker named Joseph Bennett. He described another long day harvesting ice before sunrise. He mentioned the bitter cold, the aching muscles in his shoulders, the comfort of warm coffee shared beside a small fire during lunch. But what surprised everyone most was what he didn't write about. There were no complaints, no dramatic stories, only quiet appreciation for ordinary life. "The lake was beautiful this morning," one sentence read. "The ice shone so brightly that for a moment it looked as though the entire world had been made from glass." The museum director smiled softly. Even after countless difficult winters, Joseph had still noticed beauty. The second letter belonged to another worker. His name was Patrick O'Connor. Unlike Joseph, Patrick often wrote home to his young daughter while working long harvesting seasons away from home. One sentence touched everyone reading it. "When spring comes, I shall teach you to skate upon the lake where your father works." No one knows whether he ever had the chance. History rarely answers every question. Sometimes it simply leaves us wondering. The cedar chest contained more than 50 letters. Each one revealed another ordinary life, another quiet voice, another forgotten worker whose hands had helped build the Ice Kingdom. Some letters described fierce snowstorms, others celebrated successful harvests. Several mentioned Frederic Tudor by name, not as a legendary businessman, but simply as Mr. Tudor, a man they occasionally saw inspecting shipments. To them, he wasn't yet history, he was simply another familiar face. Among the papers lay a small leather notebook. Its cover had almost fallen apart. Inside appeared short diary entries spanning nearly 15 winters. The handwriting changed slowly over time, strong, then steadier, finally slightly shaky, as though age itself could be seen across the pages. One entry caught everyone's attention: February 3rd, 1895. Today, a young fellow asked whether machines might one day replace all this work. We laughed. Perhaps we laughed too quickly. The room fell silent once more. Knowing what eventually happened made those simple words feel strangely powerful. The workers hadn't feared the future, they simply couldn't imagine it clearly. Neither can we. Perhaps people living 100 years from now will smile gently at some of our own assumptions. History has a quiet sense of humor. As the afternoon continued, volunteers carefully cataloged every document. Each letter was placed inside protective archival folders. The museum planned to display only a few originals. The rest would remain safely preserved for future generations. Not because they belonged to famous people, quite the opposite, because they belonged to ordinary people, and ordinary lives often tell history's most honest stories. Several months later, the museum opened a new exhibition called Voices from the Ice House. Visitors no longer viewed only saws or ice tongs or horse harnesses. Now they could read the actual words written by men whose hands had touched those very tools. Children stood quietly reading letters written nearly a century before they were born. Some smiled, others became unexpectedly emotional. One elderly visitor wiped away a tear after recognizing the name of his own grandfather inside one of the journals. He had never known those writings existed. Now, his grandfather spoke once again, not through photographs, not through statues, but through his own handwriting. Simple words, quiet thoughts, ordinary hopes. As evening settled outside the museum, the restored cedar chest rested peacefully inside its new glass display. Visitors passed slowly by. Most spent longer reading the letters than looking at any other exhibit, perhaps because people naturally connect with other people. Tools tell us how history worked. Letters tell us how history felt. And together, they completed a story that frozen lakes alone could never fully explain. The Ice Kingdom had never truly belonged only to merchants or inventors or famous businessmen. It belonged equally to fathers writing home, young workers dreaming about the future, friends sharing warm coffee on freezing mornings, and ordinary people who unknowingly changed the world one winter at a time.
The day was slowly coming to an end. The sun rested low above the distant hills, covering the snow with soft shades of gold and silver. A gentle breeze drifted across the frozen lake. The surface shimmered quietly beneath the fading light. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded attention. The world simply became still. It was the same lake, the same shoreline, the same forests standing patiently around the water. More than 200 years had passed since Frederic Tudor first looked across this frozen landscape and imagined something that nobody else could see. To everyone around him, it was only winter. To him, it was possibility. History often begins that way, not with loud celebrations, not with great armies, not with kings standing upon balconies. Sometimes history begins with one person asking a simple question: what if? What if frozen water could travel across the sea? What if winter itself could become a valuable cargo? What if something everyone ignored could change the world? Those questions built an empire unlike any other. Not an empire of gold, not an empire of land, but an empire built from frozen lakes, wooden ice houses, patient workers, and impossible dreams. The Ice Kingdom rose quietly. It never conquered nations, it never fought great wars. Yet somehow it entered millions of homes. It cooled hospitals, protected food, preserved medicine, connected continents, inspired inventors, and quietly changed everyday life for generations yet to come. Very few people remember the names of the men who harvested the ice. They remember even fewer of the sailors who carried it across warm oceans, the wagon drivers, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, the warehouse workers. History allowed most of their names to fade. But perhaps names are not the only way we remember people. Every time we open a refrigerator, their work continues. Every frozen meal, every cold drink, every life-saving medicine stored at the proper temperature carries a tiny piece of the road they helped build. That may be one of history's greatest gifts. Sometimes, the people we forget leave behind the world we depend upon. As darkness slowly settled across the lake, the first stars quietly appeared overhead. The old ice house stood peacefully beside the shoreline. Its wooden walls had weathered more than a century of changing seasons. Inside, no mountains of ice waited beneath fresh sawdust. Only silence remained. Yet it was not an empty silence. It was the peaceful silence of a story that had finally been told. Nearby, the museum had already closed for the evening. The lights inside faded one by one. Soon, only a single lantern remained glowing softly near the entrance. It reflected gently upon the snow, like a quiet promise that the story would always be waiting for the next curious visitor. Far away in cities around the world, people continued their ordinary evenings. Restaurants prepared dinners. Hospitals cared for patients. Fishing boats returned to harbor with refrigerated cargo. Supermarkets filled their shelves with fresh food from distant countries. Families reached into freezers without thinking twice. Everything worked so smoothly that almost nobody noticed the miracle anymore. And perhaps that was exactly how the workers of the Ice Kingdom would have wanted it. They never sought fame. They never expected statues. Most simply hoped to earn an honest living, to care for their families, to finish another winter's work before spring arrived. Without realizing it, they helped shape the future. The frozen lake remained perfectly still. Snow continued falling. One small snowflake landed gently upon the ice, then another and another, until the entire surface slowly disappeared beneath fresh white snow. It looked exactly as it had centuries before. Nature had quietly erased every footprint, every sled track, every cutting line, every sign that thousands of people had once gathered here. Yet the story had not disappeared. It had simply moved from the lake into history, from history into memory, and from memory into every modern home where cold quietly waits behind the refrigerator door. Perhaps that is the most beautiful ending history can offer. Not that something lasted forever, but that it became so successful, so useful, so completely woven into everyday life that the world eventually forgot it had ever been extraordinary. If you ever find yourself beside a frozen lake on a peaceful winter morning, pause for a moment. Listen to the wind moving softly across the ice. Look at the snow resting peacefully upon the surface. Imagine the sound of distant saws, the laughter of workers beginning another long day, the slow footsteps of horses pulling sleds toward the waiting ice house. You may not actually hear them, but perhaps for just a moment you'll feel them, because history is never truly silent. It simply whispers, and if we choose to listen, it still has remarkable stories to tell. So, as the stars shine quietly above our sleeping lake and winter gently watches over the place where an impossible dream once began, thank you for spending these peaceful hours exploring one of history's most forgotten kingdoms. May your home always be warm. May your curiosity always remain cold enough to preserve wonderful stories. And the next time a single ice cube settles softly into your glass, perhaps you'll remember a quiet frozen lake, a stubborn dreamer, thousands of ordinary workers and a remarkable kingdom that once taught the world how to capture winter itself. Good night, and thank you for listening.